your house. Are you doing well?
I am.
Better? Yeah, well, you know, it's not easy.
Welcome to the Narberth Bookshop. This is an example of a type of event that I really love because I see a lot of authors here who have done events at the store already in the past 3 years, which is really fantastic. A lot of them, and even some recent. Some of them come from the same publisher that brings us tonight's author. Doug Gordon, I'm going to introduce him. He'll speak after me and he'll introduce Mark. But Doug Gordon is the publisher of New Door Books here in Philadelphia, which has become, you know, something of a big deal. Lots of good titles. And Mark, this is his, well, I'm going to say, it's sort of your second and a half event here. Yeah, almost. So he edited a book by Liliana Velasquez's back in the back. She probably doesn't want us to draw attention to her, but anyway. But we will anyway. Which we had this crazy crowd here on a very sweltering evening a couple of years ago. It was hot. So that's a book we also have available tonight, as well as Mark's other book before this, Brief Eulogies. Let me get the title right. Brief Eulogies to Sacred Shrines?
Brief Eulogies at Roadside
Shrine, okay. Which is about the memorials that people put on the sides of roads when people have died in car accidents and so forth. Tonight he's going to present. That's just one. That's right, but it's based on that theme. What's the word? The term?
Descansos.
Descansos. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who will then do better justice to this book for Mark. But I just wanted to welcome all of you. We're celebrating our 3rd anniversary. We celebrated last month. And we love bringing these programs to you. So without further ado, here's Doug Gordon.
Well, I know that Mark does a great explanation of the genesis of this book. It has taken decades, literally, for him to write, and he'll tell you about that. Mark is not like the kind of person who started out at age 15 to be a writer. He's done many other very interesting things in his life, and he came to writing rather late. The first book he published was it was a collection of oral histories of Mexican farm workers that he went out and talked to them, collected their stories, translated them into English and put all those together in a book. And he also did his book of short stories that Ellen mentioned. And he's done that memoir with Liliana Velasquez in the back. This extraordinary story of how she came to the United States at age 14. So most of his work has been, other than that book of short stories, I'd say most of his work has been in the field of oral history or memoir. He's actually taught classes in how to tell your own story or collect stories from others. And this memoir is sort of the culmination of that kind of work because he turned his focus on himself and started collecting. Literally, he was trying to dredge up stories of his past that he had repressed for a long time. So Mark will tell you more about the genesis of the book, and it's really extraordinary, and I'm honored to have had a hand in publishing it. So please welcome Mark Lyons.
So, first of all, Ellen and Kevin, thank you so much for sponsoring my reading. This bookstore is a real oasis, and you can see it feels just wonderful to be here. And if you're here for an afternoon and want to be in a quiet place to read, come here. And the book titles, it's one of those bookstores, you feel like somebody's choosing the books that you always wanted to read, you know. Hi, Leticia, have a seat.
Hi.
So, and I certainly want to thank Doug, who basically was the person who laid out Liliana Velasquez's book, Dreams and Nightmares, as well as this one, and it's done with such love and care, and because he's both a friend and a local person, we got to work together on it, and Liliana worked with Doug on the production and the design of her book as well, so that's a real treasure. And I'm looking here, And I'm surrounded by people who just sort of overwhelm me and that have been part of my life. I'm looking at Amy and Jim and Harriet, who I met in 1972 in West Philadelphia, so that's 47 years ago. I'm not going to go through all the people who are part of my life. They're in-laws, they're new babies, they're friends for life, and it just means so much for me to share my story with you. It's, I think I've gotten to the point where I feel comfortable sharing this. It's different to share other people's stories or the stories that you make up. It's a little more complicated when it's a memoir, and when I read the introduction, it'll become clear why it doesn't feel like a big leak. I feel like I'm ready to share this story. I could not have said that even 3 years ago. So I will do that. And what I'm going to do, instead of explaining, as Doug said, instead of explaining how the story came to be, I think what I'd like to do is just read part of the prologue. And that'll give you that's sort of the setting for some sections that I will read to you. Okay? Okay. I was 52 and camping in the Adirondacks with my wife Jean Ann and our sons Jesse and Seth. Jess was 14, very full of his teen self, shoulder-length hair, string bean, fluid of body and speech, at ease with his world. As I sharpened marshmallow sticks, I watched him shake his dripping hair like a water dog, playfully harass his 8-year-old brother, and sit by the fire to read A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In 1957, I was 14, the year my mother had her nervous breakdown. Breakdown, like a car that rolls to a stop, one last gasp of a cylinder. Ultimately, she was unsalvageable, beyond repair. 1957, the year that changed our family forever, that changed me forever. What did I remember about my 14th year as I watched my high-spirited son burn his tongue on a marshmallow? Mental hospitals and desperate night sobs from my parents' bedroom, electroshock and the black dog, my mother wanting me to do unspeakable things, the ghost of Jimmy McFarlane, rage, escape plans, all in black and white. Nothing else? The kids and I headed out for a grueling and exhilarating 9-mile hike up the Algonquin Peak, up the front side, down the back. Forgotten faces and buried memories of my 14th year appeared behind white pines and large granite boulders, whispered in the creek where we soaked our blistered feet. The pigeon coop, my first slow dance, the first breast I touched, the denizens of the little theater, Mexicans hiding under an eucalyptus tree, the shooting of Dan McGrew, 7 birds in one shot, my cool day with Johnny Otis, Richie Carey, and his 49 Studi. Memories that I repeated to myself over and over down the mountain, a mantra to a lost childhood. Each day for the rest of our trip, 2 or 3 memories buried for 4 decades found their way to the surface, demanding my attention. I wrote them down, short notes, fragments. Then I took these seeds home and I began to write. I wrote for 4 years, my list of lost memories growing, begetting other memories that kept multiplying themselves, filled with details, conversations, vivid scenes, unraveling emotions. I found many lost shards of myself and began to put 14 and 15-year-old Mark back together again. This story, as I first began to write it more than 20 years ago, was about reclaiming my childhood. It was not about forgiving. It was about my suffering and rage, the sustaining power of private places where teenage boys go, and how as an adult I was still caught in the orbit of my mother's dark gravitational pull. I was so focused on excavating the pieces of my own story and reassembling them that I could not really imagine my mother's story. My teen rage did not consider her pain. She was not a sufferer. She was a tyrant who imposed suffering on those who loved her, whom I had escaped to save myself. I put my writing in a drawer for 17 years. Enough. I turned to fiction and writing oral histories of migrant farm workers. In my 70s, with grown children, I returned to this story, unfinished business. As a parent, I cannot imagine a more profound grief than losing my children, knowing I had driven them away. Revisiting these stories now, adding more chapters, I have searched for a way to imagine my mother's suffering and her grief, to recompose the shards of her life. Ultimately, this story is about forgiving her, or perhaps it is about forgiving myself for never having forgiven her. So there's several things I'm going to talk about, and I won't talk about the structure of the book. Darn it, sorry. But I'm going to talk about some sort of themes that go through it, and certainly one of the main themes has to do with secrets that families have, and how they carry them with them, how they hide them, how they're discovered, and what those secrets do, because you don't just leave those secrets behind once they're exposed, but in fact, those secrets go with you for the rest of your life in some way or other. The story, my memoir actually begins with a very happy scene, which was 4 months before my mother made her first trip to the mental hospital. It was at a cast party at our house. My mother was the founder and sort of the center of this Downey Community Theater, which is where all the very straight people in this very straight and white community I grew up in had this chance to be eccentric. So they acted in plays, and they built the sets in our backyard, and they put on performances. Some of them were really serious theater, like the Glass Menagerie. My mother had just directed and acted in a play called, oh, now I'm forgetting on it. Huh?
Cadillac?
The solid gold Cadillac. This is my wife. I have to introduce her. Thank God. She's my memory palace as well as my true love. Solid Gold Cadillac. It was a famous play on Broadway in the 50s. Zazu Pitts starred in it. Also, she had directed it, starred in it. So they had this big cast party at our house. I was there, and there's a scene where they start saying, "Where is Lou? We want Lou. We want Lou." Well, the Lou is the dangerous Lou, who is one of the famous evil people in the Robert Service poem, "The Shooting of Dan McGrew." So my mom stood up on a table and recited all 59 lines, gesticulating, people swooning. It was a wonderful scene, and there was no hint at that point that she was going someplace else. Well, 4 months later, I was alone with her in our house. My dad was away for a couple days for work, and suddenly she fell apart and could not stop crying, and I spent the whole night holding her uncontrollably while she was sitting on the edge of the floor next to the bed, because she couldn't even get up to go to sleep. And my father came home 2 days later, and the next morning she was in a mental hospital, beginning a long series of trips that included electroshock and long hospitalizations. So that's sort of the background. And the secret, the question, part of what was part of my process, and as a teenager, you're not thinking, there have to be secrets here, I have to figure out what's going on. You're not thinking that way. But over the next year period, 2 major secrets were unfolded as part of what, in retrospect, was clearly part of my mother's demise. The first secret, which I won't read about, was, and I heard this, was the first secret that my younger sister, who was only 2 at the time, my mother kept saying to my father in the middle of the night, where I could hear, "I'm going to tell the children that Jimmy McFarland, the best friend of the family, who was also married, is the true father of Michelle, my younger sister." So that was the first big secret. To be honest with you, at 14, I didn't believe it. I thought, so that's part of it. Okay, so then the next, what there is to, and there are different sections in this, and the next, this is called What There Is to Tell, number 2. Hunched in her chair, sucking on a Pall Mall, my mother stares at the fireplace with no fire. Dad sits across the room in his couch, his stocking feet resting on the coffee table. I cross my legs on the comforting carpet and open the sports page to read about how the Dodgers are finally coming to LA in the spring. There's something in the room, a silent kind of tension, the way things seem to be absolutely still before an earthquake. My mother looks at my father with a signal. My father obeys. Mark, your mother needs you to leave the room. But I just want to read the sports. Please, just go to the den, or maybe check the door on your pigeon coop. I saw a cat in the backyard earlier. He's on edge, a hint of panic. Bill, my mother finally clears her throat and speaks, her voice a strange quiver. Tell him. Tell me what? She's still looking at my father. Tell him about the black dog. I'm tired of all this. What the hell's the black dog? I've never heard of a black dog. Dad tries to take control, stands. Mark, don't swear at your mother. I've asked you, please, just leave. I'll explain later. Now leave. I hold my palm ups like showing I have nothing to hide and look at my father through the tops of my eyes as to say, what the fuck? Leave. I lie on my bed, pillow propped up against the windowsill, having one of those moments that make no sense, but I know I will never forget. Why is my mother afraid of me? My body feels helplessly sad, no words or images. An hour later, my father opens the door and sits on my bed. Your mother wants me to tell you about the black dog. I nod. Just get on with it. She's afraid she's going to ask you to do something horrible. Like what? For 2 or 3 minutes, I adjust the sound of our breathing. My father can't look at me. Like what? What? Like take down your pants and let her see you. It takes my father a very long time to say this, like playing a 78 record at 33 RPM, the volume way down. His lips are all thin and stiff, like he's having trouble getting each word out. What did you say? You heard me. I did hear him, but want to make him say it again. No, I'm not sure I heard you. She's afraid she will ask you to take down your pants. I stare at the green wall, 3 unpatched cracks, like a desert road map. Or let her touch you. His face is turned away from me now. His hand reaches for the bony angle of his chin. Touch me? Yes. And ask you to do certain things. And she feels guilty. I cover my ears with my hands. My father's voice is muffled, but not enough. It's the black dog, Mark. Our exquisite discomfort leaves my father and me mute. Finally, when he closes the bedroom door behind him, I breathe again. Another night of relentless shuffling sounds and cries and shadows down the hallway from my bedroom, then the merciful morning. I'm awakened by determined activity, packing sounds of leather suitcases. By the time I'm dressed, Mother's already in the car, staring down the blacktop driveway, waiting for Father to deliver her back to the hospital. So, the black dog. I am the black dog, hounding my mother, driving her to the hospital. So it gets a little bit easier after this, guys. Okay, so eventually I was able to flee home. I went to college in Northern California, and then eventually moved to New York and then Philadelphia. But I wasn't ever really able to escape, because I carried with me all these secrets and the loneliness and the fear of loving caused by the dissolution of my family. For years I had what I call recapitulation nightmares. And I used that word, and I said it sounded like I was using it right, so I looked it up, and recapitulation actually is a biological term. In biology, when an organism repeats ancestral evolutionary changes in its development. When an organism repeats ancestral evolutionary changes in its development, basically what it says is we're doomed to repeat our family's history. So here's recapitulation nightmare number 1. It's called It's a Boy. I was 38 at the time. 1980, Sherry, my first wife, was pregnant. something that brought us great joy, her first ultrasound. As the doctor passed the sensor over the Sherry's belly, the black and white image appeared on the screen, and the lub-lub rhythm of the baby's heart filled the exam room. There it was, a penis. A penis! I began to sob. Not the sob of a proud father who is assured that he will have the son he always wanted, that the family line will continue. Not the sob of a father when told his baby appears completely normal. No, the relieved sob of a father terrified that he would have a daughter and visit upon her the sins of his mother. So this is recapitulation nightmare number 2. It's called Riding the Wild Stallion. I was 54, just 2 years after I started writing my memoir, actually. My son Jesse, who you remember from the introduction, was 16, a tough year for us. Some days we were in open warfare, shooting words at each other with intent to maim. Some days we silently called a temporary truce, exhausted from the fight. He'd become a wild stallion, stomping and thrashing behind the door of his second-floor bedroom, his stall. We shouted accusations about all things unimportant. Doors slammed. It would take us a day or two to let go, to make words not coated in venom. After our household conflagrations, which seemed to happen weekly, I would crash, a deep black sadness. I knew where this was going. Jess was preparing to flee, to free himself from our family, from me. 30 years after I left home without looking back, it's payback time. Jess was in his Kool-Aid hair phase, wherein he bleached his shoulder-length brown hair surfer blonde, then dyed it with packets of Kool-Aid. Green one week, then purple, then red. Remember this, Emily? I suspected he was trying to get a rise out of me, but I didn't take the bait. Very cool, Jess. So far, I think I like the purple best. Actually, I did think he looked cool. My brilliant boy trying on his colors. About once a month, Jess had to prep his hair for the Kool-Aid application, bleaching the natural brown roots that emerged from his cranium. He got out his bottle of bleach, stood in front of the bathroom mirror, and strand by strand applied the liquid with a special brush. However, there was a problem. Standing in front of the mirror, he could not see the back of his head to properly detect the devil brown roots. He usually asked his girlfriend to apply the bleach to the area he couldn't visualize, but tonight she was away with her family. Jess came into the TV room where I was watching the Phillies play Pittsburgh, top of the 8th. Bleach bottle in one hand, application brush in the other, he asked, "Hey, would you mind brushing some bleach on the hair on the back of my neck?" "Sure, why don't you sit here on the floor between my legs and we'll watch the game while I bleach you up." I was working hard to sound nonchalant. A misfired tone of voice would set off a firestorm. "What's the color this week?" "Orange." "Orange, nice summer tint." Jess settled his long-legged, gangly self down between my knees onto the floor, and we both watched the game as I carefully, meticulously, almost artistically dipped the brush into the bleach bottle, inspected the back of his neck for natural brown strands, and applied the liquid until the color was erased. I took 15 minutes to do a job that should have consumed no more than 5. Neither of us seemed impatient for me to finish. "Thanks. Sure, anytime." The Phillies won 4-3. God, I love this kid. Maybe, just maybe, we would be okay. Recapitulation nightmare number 3. I was 32. I had just ended a relationship with a woman who I'd been with for 3 years and loved very much. She wanted to continue, but I froze with fear, convinced that I could never be happy with her or anyone. So I broke her heart and mine. Once again, my loving was venom. I was the most depressed I'd ever been, desperate to love without fleeing, to believe that I was not dangerous, sure that I would never learn that. I tried on suicide. How soon before I started making plans? I was running out of time. Time to see a therapist. "So, what brings you here?" he asked. "I'm 32 and have 10 years left before I go crazy like my mother." So, another big theme in this in my memoir has to do with sanctuaries, and my sanctuaries as a boy, places that I went to flee the chaos of my house, places that felt safe, and where I felt somewhat in control, and where I could in some way find some peace. And one of the major places that I found sanctuary had to do with birds and bird watching and raising birds. I raised pigeons. I built this masterful coop out of redwood. This was in Southern California. With this, it was like a mansion. It was like a McPigeon mansion. It was spectacular. And I had up to 38 pigeons. One point, I had a 3x5 card for each one. I knew when they were born. They all had names. I knew them by sight. I would train them to home and take them places and let them fly, and they would fly home. I would race them from the schoolyard or whatever back home. When the chaos entered our house, a retreat, my sanctuary was often the pigeon coop. And sometimes I would we had a big, it was dead by then, an old gigantic pepper tree where the pigeons would land in before coming back into the coop. And I would lie on the ground and just watch them circling and then landing. And then sometimes when things were really hard, I would just go sit up against the wire, the chicken wire in the sun, and just close my eyes and go to sleep. So, and also I was sort of known as the bird man of our neighborhood. I got the reputation as the kid who could fix birds, save birds, or if I didn't save them, I pretended like I did and put them away quietly. But I learned also how to quietly put birds away who needed that. And one of my favorite, this neighbor came over. I never met him before. He knocked on the door. Mom and Dad were at the hospital. I was alone on a Saturday morning. This guy comes in and he says, I heard you know how to fix birds. And before I could say anything, he opens up a shoebox, and inside is a hummingbird. And with a broken wing. So this was in the summertime, so I spent the rest of the summer taking this hummingbird around 4 or 5 times a day, sitting on my finger, going to the honeysuckle and to the roses and all the sweet flowers. And it was like the bird became, in a sense, my best friend. So this is another bird story. It's called Shooting the Curl. I was 15. It's at Sunset Beach, where we'd summered for many, many years. And I knew, because of what had been happening, my mother had just gotten back again from the mental hospital. I just knew this was going to be our last summer. So, it's a howling, cold, gray day, dry seaweed rolling down the sand like a tumbleweed, clouds swirling. I pulled my sweater down over my head, walked down to inspect the water. The waves are angry. A loose flock of seagulls heads north, flying into the wind, fighting the storm. Quickly exhausted, they have to stop flying and go into a glide, only to be pushed back up the beach. Many of the birds give up, their breast muscles cramping, refusing to pump their wings. They settle onto the sand to wait out the storm on one leg, head pointed into the wind. Offshore, I watch one mature herring gull defiantly struggling against the wind, hovered over the trough where the giant waves are breaking. The seagull spreads its tail feathers and slightly dips them, causing its body to dip downward. It's going into a dive. Just as it reaches the top of the waves, which is now curled over, the tail flicks and the wings open as the angle of the body flattens out, and the bird disappears into the spume. I'm on my toes, following the wave as it rolls over and over, the curl hurtling toward me. No bird appears. Suicide. I feel a little desperate and helpless as I imagine the gull thrashed by the furious wave, the sadness of a seabird drowning. I hate the wave, its power, its noise, the arrogance of the curl as it moves up the beach. Then I see it. Just as the last crash of the curl folds over before the wave meekly flattens 200 miles from upshore, the gull glides out of the end of the tube, spreads its tail and rises skyward on the upward draft created by the dying wave. It heads out to sea to catch another wave. The gull is a surfer, waiting for the right wave, then diving into the breaker, shooting the curl as the wave pulls it 200 yards upshore against the unbeatable wind. Nobody will believe what I have seen. I will keep this secret. I know people hate seagulls, but I love seagulls. So another sanctuary for me were the orchards. This was Southern California in the mid-50s, was like it was in an adolescence, as I was, and going through all sorts of changes. As with me, 5 years later, you would not recognize Southern California. And this is a story about both that adolescence and what the orchards meant to me. When I was 5, we bought our house on the unpaved dead end of Stamps Road, our half-acre of pepper, pine, and palm trees, olives, apricots, lemons, and honeysuckle. At one time, our barn-red house had been a real ranch house. In the front yard, we raised goldfish in a round cement pond where a windmill had once been. Our neighborhood was surrounded by orange groves, mostly Valencias, a few navels. My first favorite grove was Dr. Steers. Richie Carey took me there first after I met him in first grade. Richie Carey is he was my one true friend and really the first person I think I really loved. I started to walk home with him from school down Downey Avenue. Hey, want me to show you a shortcut, he says? Sure, why not? Better roll up your pants first. They're irrigating. Spring was the best time when the giant tractors plowed dikes around each tree. Then they cranked open the rusty valves inside 4-foot diameter cement pipes. Whoosh! We raced the river of water moving through the magic grove with our shoes off and pant legs rolled up. Nourished now, the trees bloomed blossoms of small flowers, and I opened the window of my bedroom to let their sweet scent in. We climbed down to the base of the giant valve pipes and searched for crawdads and black widow spiders and green snakes and frogs. In January, the groves were the quietest, but there was this oily smell, an army of stinky smudge pots burning all night to beat the frost like little guard gnomes. When I get back from our last sunset beach vacation, I head over to Richie's, taking the shortcut through the orchard. First I smell the smoke. Then I realize that the orchard, all 400 acres of it, is gone. In the month that I've been away, the orchard has disappeared. It looks like photographs of Hiroshima after the bomb. A sign 10 feet wide, 5 feet high announces Cherokee Groves, residential properties for sale, quarter-acre lots, $10,000. Thompson developers, keep out. Giant yellow machines roamed the wasteland. Stump pullers yanked the few remaining trees out of the ground, roots and all. I can almost hear them screaming. Bulldozers herd the trees, still green with oranges hanging on them, into 15-foot high piles. Men douse the trees with something, toss a match. Whoosh, like a funeral pyre. Trees burned at the stake. I feel like crying. I want to throw rocks at the machines and the men manning them. In 1 month, my trees have all disappeared, gone. Development, creeping subdivisions. Like a horror movie, an army of giant, noshing, munching monsters roaming the countryside and destroying everything in its path. I do not recognize this place. I no longer feel at home here. There would be times when, even during the worst of her illness, cheers guys. There's more back there.
There's more back there.
Oh boy. Thank you, Julie. There would be times even when I was at home, and certainly later on, when I would discover things about myself that I realized, oh, that's my mom. And I would be reminded about sort of what a passionate, alive woman she had once been and how engaged with the world she had been. And this is one of those stories. It actually occurred when I was relatively young. I was 21 and just about to graduate from college. In college, on a particularly lonely day, I wandered into Moe's bookstore on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley and browsed through the stacks of used books, askance and unordered by the author or subject. There on the counter sat a huge book, close to 2 inches thick with a gilded cover, The History of Don Quixote de la Mancha, with illustrations by Gustave Doré. For half an hour I turned the pages and ran my fingers over Doré's engravings. Eldon astride his astride his bedraggled horse Rocinante on his first sally forth, Sancho and his master engaging in philosophical reflection, them setting out to defend the world from evil dragons, Quixote famished and yearning for his lady-love Dulcinea, over 100 plates. Sometime during a lucid spell between her hospitalizations, my mother had told me about Doré, who in the late 19th century illustrated books that I'd never read, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Paradise Lost, The Divine Comedy. How, when commissioned to illustrate Don Quixote, Doré retraced the 1,200-mile voyage of El Don and made through Spain 200 years before in his quest to revive chivalry and bring justice to the world. The artist absorbed the dust and the wind of La Mancha, sketched horses and mountains and gardens and plains, then visited museums to learn how the peasants and aristocrats of 17th century Spain dressed, what armor they wore, what weapons they carried. Then he sat down to make engravings that forever define readers' image of Quixote and Sancho and the world they set out to make right. There in Mose, for a moment, I felt proud of my mother. Another one of those things she just knew that she cared about when she was still capable of caring and passion. When she had wanted her son, what she had wanted her son to know too, about important books, about literature. Then, 500 miles from the home I had fled, I wandered into a moldy used bookstore seeking refuge and found an old gilded tome that reminded me of my mother, who had stopped tilting at windmills. Did I feel sad for her? I don't remember. But on my bookshelf rests a Dover book, Doré's Illustrations for Don Quixote. So I'm just going to read one little more. Okay. So this is from the epilogue. Is actually the last two paragraphs of the epilogue. This is the story. This is the irony, perhaps ultimately the greatest gift of my mother. 2 decades ago, hiking on the Algonquin Trail of the Adirondacks, where I began my catalog of memories of my 14th year, I was not a writer. My mother's melancholia, her threat from the world, retreat from the world and from me, is what started me on this journey as I searched for words to reclaim the buried part of my childhood. As I wrote this story, I learned the power of words, learned to love them, to become a writer. Over the years, as I've written and published, I've occasionally fantasized about sending my stories to my mother, dead before I had begun to write. She reads them and awaits my next visit. After being home a day or so, we hunker down to business. She sits in her chair with a cup of coffee, my marked-up manuscript in her hand. We talk about word choices, images, subtleties she has discovered, parts that hit the mark, parts over or underwrought. I refill her cup and she says, "I think you're on to something." "You know where I got my love for words," I say. So if you have any questions or comments, fire away, guys. Yeah. So I have to do some, this is...
Molly.
I know, but I'm trying to say, no, she's not my mother-in-law. She's the mother of my daughter-in-law, my dearest daughter-in-law. This is Molly.
So did that hummingbird actually drink from the flowers when you took them around?
You want to know about the hummingbird? Yeah. You think I'm making that up? Is that what you think I'm making it up? Well, it's interesting because the tongue of a hummingbird, you know, at New Year's when you blow those things and they go out and then they come back like that, you know, those little noisemakers, it actually rolls up. And the beak of a hummingbird is about 2 inches long, of this particular kind of hummingbird, and the tongue goes out another 2 inches. And at first I fed it through an eyedropper, and I could see, and you could see, because the eyedropper was clear, you could see this little tongue darting back and forth in the eyedropper. And then I took it out, and it would sit on my finger, and I mean, by then it knew me and sort of was comfortable sitting on my finger, and yeah, that was, she still doesn't believe it.
Nobody
Get me a hummingbird.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, that was great, Mark.
Thanks, Joe.
I was hit by your saying you felt dangerous, that you yourself felt dangerous. What a horrible burden to carry. How conscious was that feeling that you were dangerous? You know, in relationships, you remember.
As an adult, I was very conscious of it because I felt like I really hurt a lot of people who I cared a lot about, primarily because I couldn't stay. So, so I felt guilty about that, and felt like I was dangerous to get involved with because ultimately I knew I couldn't stay. So I was very conscious of that.
I guess I'm asking partly because Doug had said you would repressed a lot, which would, I'm thinking, did that mean you didn't even know what was motivating you, or you had buried a lot of the actual facts of your childhood, but it wasn't that repressed. You were aware of running from your past.
Well,
and how you've been damaged by your past. You hadn't buried.
Well, I think when I started to write my story, I repressed a lot of memories, a lot of those details, some I read. And there are lots of sections, and they're certainly partly too long, about repressing parts of my childhood, which I would call a happy childhood. Like my friendship with Richie and the stuff I did with the birds, and adventures I had, and times I spent time on a citrus farm on the California-Mexican border, and got to know Mexican farm workers who were wetbacks, as they called them, and worked with them. And those were sort of like adventures and eye-openers. And those things were not in my memory bank at all until I started writing. And my writing was really, in a lot of ways, rediscovering those sort of the other part of Mark that wasn't just in the shadow of my mother's vortex. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other? Yeah, John.
Are you in contact with your mom's family, the cousins that would be of her branch of the family?
That family has long been gone. My aunt, who lived close to us in California, died shortly after my mother did, in the mid-90s. Yeah.
Do you have fond memories of your mom before she became ill?
Yeah, a lot of the stuff was little theater stuff. I mean, and she created, there was this whole world, and the first chapter is sort of a catalog of all these characters, or they were like playing another role, and my mother, because she was sort of the center of this world, would spend time talking with them, and she would tell me lots about their lives, and she was very wise, and that part, there were a lot of positive memories of being with her. And there's several more instances in the book where I talk about those kind of moments that made me real proud of her. There's another one. How many people know who Joseph Karsh is? Well, he's was one of the most famous photographers during the 50s and 60s. He was the guy who made that famous photograph of Churchill with the stogie. And he did a lot of those pictures, like of Marilyn Monroe and actors, and he was on Life magazine. He was from Canada. Well, my mother knew all about him and knew the story of how Karsh got that photograph. And the way he got the photograph, if you want to know, is because he really looks angry. He looks like, you're not going to fuck with me, Germany. But what he was saying is, he was pissed off at Karsh because he had put the... he didn't have a stogie at that point. He had put a stogie in, and Karsh went over and this is Churchill, this is Winston here, and just grabbed the stogie out of his mouth, but he had in his hand that cord where you can push the button and hit the clicker, and he turned away and just clicked it like that. And the photograph you see in life, where he looks like, you don't mess with this guy, was him being furious that this young punk photographer had dared to take his stogie out of his mouth. That's how. So my mother.
Not that picture, right?
Yeah, that's it.
I was just
Oh
going to
my
say,
God.
I was looking it up.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah,
There it is. You all know this photograph.
Wow.
So that's, you know, that's it. That's Winston without his stogie. So my mother knew about all this stuff, you know, and she would teach me, there was all this stuff, she loved poetry and all, and there's a whole section which I didn't read, about her teaching me about iambic pentameter when I was like 10. And sort of, and telling me all these books I had to read. Of course, as a kid, I would never read them, and I've gone back and read them. So yeah, there are a lot of those memories, and they are in the book. Yeah.
I have one follow-up question to that.
But-
Did you find that more of those memories came back as you started to open to the past?
You know, this is they came back the second time around. And why, and so I put the book away. I picked it up again when I was 72, after 17 years of not doing anything with it. I never intentioned, you know, I was done with it. And what, by then, I had been for a long time with my wonderful wife, Jean Ann, and there was no doubt I wasn't going to leave her, and that we were in this together, and that my life had really changed. It was clear that my kids, although we'd had some struggles, weren't going to flee to save themselves. That our story was very different from my family's story. And it was then I could return and begin to think about my mother's life and to have memories, positive memories, let go of my anger, which I still had in my 60s on some level, and realize and be able to look at her fondly. You know, and to have those kind of memories. And there are a lot of those in there. Yeah. Yes, Suzanne.
So what do you think happened to her?
What happened to her?
Was there any indication before this time, as far as you knew?
Nothing, no. I mean, the question is that there was, I mean, as a 15-year-old, there was that, I was completely blindsided. And somebody who read the book, Joy Stocky, who published my book, another book of mine, who's a wonderful editor, and she read it, and she said, you need to include in this some foretelling in that first chapter about all this stuff that's going on, this wonderful scene of the cast party, that there's some foretelling that something's wrong. And we struggle with that, and I decided I couldn't do that because for me, there was no foretelling. I was really blindsided. I suspect my father wasn't, you know, and I think that part of what hit her one is there's an ongoing discussion with my sister because she knows about my mother saying that this other person is her father, whether that's true or not. But my mother thought it was true, and certainly her sexual, her incestuous feelings about me, in a community where nobody talks about that in the mid-50s. I think that those two things really pushed her over. You know, I think guilt drove her a lot. But yeah, just.
So when you first started writing this, was this to just journal, to try to process your own feelings, or were you planning on writing a book, or how did that happen?
No, you know, when I described in the prologue sort of being caught with these, you know, seeing Jesse at 14, and I'm sure we all do that about kids, you know, say, oh, well, my son's 20, what was I doing at 20, or I was 5, you know, and it's not a competitive thing, but just a reflective thing. I just decided I wanted to reclaim, because a lot of things I wrote down were memories of cool things that 15-year-old boys do, you know, and sort of realizing I wasn't just caught up in this vortex. I wasn't just a victim, or my life wasn't just filled with chaos and tragedy or whatever. And those were the first things I wrote about. It was sort of a way of just for myself reclaiming it. And it's sort of, in some way I got really in touch with me, and I felt like I was embracing this 15-year-old. And it was a real visceral feeling. And I cried a lot when I was writing that, but I wasn't the sad stuff that was making me, it was sort of, oh, well, this kid, you know, he raised, you know, I found my pigeon journals, you know, it was all this stuff. So it was really just reclaiming that. And I did, and I wasn't ever thinking I would publish it. I really just put it away. What happened is I started wanting to fudge. I wanted to make a story sexier, or, you know, or more interesting, you know. And I realized, oh, well, that's what fiction is. It, you know, it compels you to make up stories that have a different truth. So I stopped and started writing fiction. Yeah. Yeah. Becca?
Just brings so many my own memories to life. I wasn't going to say anything.
Well, you
Scratching his head.
scratch it. Oh, okay. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Where California did you live in?
Southern California. It was a place called Downey. It's exactly halfway between downtown LA and Disneyland. It's on the edge of Orange County. It's in LA County, but it's on the orange edge. And it's right next, the two cities which are closer to LA that are next to us are Compton and Watts, which were entirely, even then, entirely black communities. I lived in an entirely middle-class white community. Yeah. Ellen?
So your relationship with birds obviously inspires the title. Will you just explain in terms of the concept of homing and pigeons, how that relates to you, your story?
Okay. So homing, certainly, I mean, the title is a metaphor, you know. And, I mean, I don't know, I mean, pigeons have a unique ability to home. And it's different from other birds who migrate, who go from one place to another, because you can take a pigeon who you've trained anywhere, in any direction, and they will find a way home. Okay? They can fly thousands. I mean, they have these contests, and they fly from Florida up to Philadelphia. So, you know, so that was my involvement. I mean, my pigeon coop was really my refuge. And there are lots of descriptions in the book of me raising pigeons and what that meant. But also then when there would be a crisis in our house, often that chapter would end up with me in my pigeon coop, just for a paragraph or whatever. And then the other piece of it is I feel like when I returned, I mean, there were sort of two ways I went home. One was to sort of discover 17 years ago sort of a fuller life of myself as a teen. And then the other was when I returned to it, really returning to my primarily my mother, but my father too. There's some chapters in about him, but sort of returning to her to try to see her life in a different kind of way and feel sympathy for it. Yeah, Amy?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because it isn't clear to me what role your father played in any of this. Did he know what was going on? Did he try to intervene?
Yes and no. Yeah, there is something about certain kinds, and I think my mother ultimately was just really seriously depressed at a time when the only thing they had to treat depression was Thorazine. They didn't have antidepressants. At that point, they didn't even have anxiolytics. I think Valium came out in 1960 or something like that. And there's a way that narcissistic isn't the right word, but it's self-centeredness, where you're sort of so focused on your own pain that you can't imagine the impact you're having on other people. So my mother, because she'd been a very active person, she wasn't a passive depressive. She was a controlling depressive and controlled everything. And one of the things, she didn't spend more than literally 5 minutes alone by herself any time for the next 35 years after that first trip to the hospital in 1957. Either my father was with her, or we had hired people who stayed with her every minute. So my father, a woman would come and be with my mom all day long while my dad went to work, and then leave when my dad came home. And so she would not let him do anything with me, like go out in the front yard or play catch, or with my sister. My sister was shipped out all over the place. And he bought into that. I mean, he on one hand was an enabler. There's a chapter in there called, I don't know if you ever remember the movie Ordinary People. You know, it's, you know, and there's a chapter where I went to see that and I couldn't drive home. I was just, you know, I was just so overwhelmed. And the reason is in that movie, the mother makes the father choose between her or the kids, and he chose the kids. And my father didn't. My father sort of went along with my mother's program, and we were sort of non-entities in his life.
And he pretended not to notice?
He just was, I don't, you know, it's really hard to tell. I mean, what happened also after my mother died, there was this 6 years of sort of us really finding ways to be together. And he traveled here and spent time with us and our kids, and we sort of had the relationship that I wanted to have with him from the time I was a teenager.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, you remember when he came? Yeah, it was magical. Yeah. So, Bob, you had a question?
Yes, memoir writing seems like a particularly risky kind of writing, especially if you have siblings who are still alive, and you are recognizing that memory is deeply personal and subjective.
Yeah.
And you also want accuracy, and so you're kind of caught between wanting to present something that will be true to your siblings' experience as well, but you're really telling your story. And I'm just curious, sort of, on top of that is suggestions from other writers who say you might want to have, you know, some foreshadowing here. That are pushing you away from your own narrative as well. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little about some of the tensions that existed within the memoir writing experience.
In terms of, well, my parents, by the time anything was written, both, I mean, my dad died in 1997, like 2 or 3 years after I started. And actually the first fiction piece I wrote was sort of based on me going home a lot, and last year he was dying, and telling him family stories, which in fact had a different real ending than the ending I gave him, so I didn't need to get at him, so so they were stories that stirred up a lot of stuff in me, but they were really fond memories that I shared with him. My brother was really out of the picture by then, and he had never treated me well, and in fact we became close around the time of my father dying. We found a way to be there with him and for each other during that time. My sister, who was really the reason I went home over and over and over again for years, she was 2 years old. She was my sort of sane connection to the family, and I was hers. And we did all this stuff together. And at some point, I'm not even sure how she got wind of. I don't think I told her. But she asked me, said, do you think that the reason, one thing that happened during all this, because I was away at college or here, I see my sister with some frequency, is she was shipped out to this woman to live with her, basically almost fostered with somebody who she didn't like, who in fact, the husband was very abusive, not of my sister, but of the other kids in the family. So it was horrendous. And my sister asked me, she said, do you think that the reason that Dad ignored me was because he knew that I was Jimmy McFarland's son? Not just before, when I was working on this and a piece of the story was published in a journal, I read the section to her about the discovery of, and she said she acted shocked. She said, I don't remember this. And it was like I told her that for the first time. But I was sure. And then we had long discussions about whether she wanted to have DNA testing to determine who the father was. And she said, you know, I want to let it lie because either answer is awful. Either I am my father's daughter and he completely neglected me, or I'm not, and that explains why. You know, there's not like a solution that's going to make me feel better. So she, you know, I get it. She decided not to get tested. Yeah. She was not happy with that chapter, because she didn't remember it. Part of the chapter is describing a photograph that I found of my sister sitting on Jimmy McFarland's knee. I mean, she had to be less than 2 because after that, my mother didn't see any of those people after she had her nervous breakdown. And there's a photograph of my blonde sister sitting at 2, sitting on the knee of blonde Jimmy McFarland. You know, I haven't shown that to her. Yeah. any other. Somehow I feel like this story feels like a downer, but it really isn't. I mean, because of the second part, the homing, it
That's why we bought the book.
burned this book.
Taking it home.
Yeah, but you bought it before I read it. It really isn't. In fact, it was a real liberating experience. There's a thing that happened the first time, and it was completely out of the blue. We have about 20 people come to our house every Thanksgiving. Some of them who are here. And we go around the table, you know, sort of saying what, you know, what you do, saying what we're thankful for. And it was the first time in 60 years that I said, I wished my mother was here. I miss my mother. So that's really felt like coming home. So, thank you guys so much.